What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to celebrate the 75th anniversary of one of my all-time favorite movies, Sunset Boulevard, which premiered at Radio City Music Hall on August 10th, 1950, and ran for 7 weeks. This is one of those movies that's kind of dangerous for me to make a video about because the movie is filled with so many fascinating historical details, each of which deserve their own 10-hour documentary series. The entire video I would be fighting the urge to go down every other rabbit hole or explore every other tangent. It's going to be very challenging to stay on topic and actually discuss this movie. And I should say, if you've never seen Sunset Boulevard, I'll be vague initially, but the movie begins with the spoiler of all spoilers, so it's going to be impossible for me to discuss this movie without spoiling it for the unconverted.
Hedda Hopper speaking. I'm talking from the bedroom of Norma Desmond. Don't bother with a rewrite, man. Take this direct. Ready? As day breaks over the murder house.
But I'll make the pitch as such. There's some movies out there where it feels like every single ingredient, every single creative decision was tailor-made in a lab for your specific tastes and preferences, and those movies ultimately end up becoming your favorite movies. But I'll go one step further with Sunset Boulevard. This is one of those movies where it defined my tastes and preferences. Everybody likes to feel like, at any age, that they already know all that you need to know about movies, and I've been guilty of that behavior my entire life. But when I saw Sunset Boulevard, I was just beginning to get obsessed with film history, the movies from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and I was just almost like a drug-crazed maniac, reaching out, looking for my fix wherever I could find it. But I had the beginning of an outline of the silent era and the early talkies and the pre-code era and then the first big golden age of Hollywood. So I had a working understanding of some of the figures that were involved in this movie. But to see what amounts to a dark film noir, tragic, haunted house story about the silent era up through 1950 that ultimately ends in tragedy, I just was absolutely mesmerized by everything about it, from the style to the dialogue to the performances to its sense of history to the withering, biting look at Hollywood. I just loved everything about it, and each time I revisit the movie, I'm just like, oh my God, how does this movie even exist? And even for Billy Wilder, he'll be the first to tell you, this is one of those movies where just everything fell into place, from the cast to the studio's cooperation. It seemed like this was one of those movies that was just destined to be. And 75 years later, I find that it's more relevant than ever.
I needed the Paramount studio where we were shooting at Paramount. We got the permission. I needed DeMille to play DeMille, and he played it. I needed somebody to play the Stroheim part, who at one time had been a director and had made a picture with Gloria Swanson. And indeed, we found that old picture that he had directed with her, Queen Kelly. We needed old faces, and we got Mr. Warner, who played Jesus, and we got Buster Keaton. Everything sort of kind of fell into our lap. Everything was just right.
So I've been a fan of this movie since the late 90s, when I wasn't even 50 years old yet, but I originally owned the movie on DVD, and all the clips I'll be using throughout this video come from the DVD because it's much easier to rip a DVD than a Blu-ray. And I've got a Blu-ray for Sunset Boulevard. However, there's a 75th anniversary Blu-ray that was supposed to come out yesterday, and then I got an email saying that it wouldn't arrive for another week or two. I'm like, well, motherfucker, the 75th anniversary is this Sunday, so I'm not about to skip the anniversary in order to watch your new Blu-ray. Maybe there'll be some fascinating commentary tracks. Maybe there'll be some fascinating documentaries. I don't know. Part of this video, I was going to review that Blu-ray, but if they're delayed, I'm like, time waits for no man, and we're going to plow on ahead. Because when it comes to my opinion of the movie, I doubt there's anything new on that Blu-ray that'll make my already sky-high opinion climb even higher, but who knows? Maybe there'll be some nuggets on there that just absolutely blow my mind. But in any case, back to Billy Wilder. When I was first getting into movies, luckily, Billy Wilder was still alive. He was very much like the man about town. He wasn't making movies anymore, but he was doing tons of interviews. I got this book of interviews with Cameron Crowe, who was a big admirer of his due to the movie The Apartment. And while Cameron Crowe's not necessarily one of my favorite filmmakers, he gets a lot of credit. He gets a lot of credit in the bank with me for at least sitting down with this master and just going through his entire career and just basically picking over all the little details of all of his best movies. And when people discuss the first golden age of Hollywood, which for me I define very loosely, it's basically everything that Hollywood was doing prior to World War II. But one of the ingredients that made the first golden age so spectacular was the influx of European talent. A lot of filmmakers were fleeing Europe with war brewing in every corner, and Billy Wilder might be the most successful import from Europe at that time because he was the classic 1-2 punch. He was a writer-director. He was already making movies in Germany before he fled west. And I read some interview at one point where he was basically briefly making a living as a gigolo, not necessarily as like a male prostitute, but he would travel around on boats and dancing with women and entertaining them. And as a result, he remained a very good dancer for all his days. Anytime you see behind-the-scenes images from the sets of his movies, you can always see him like dancing with his female leads. He knew what he was doing. And there are great dance sequences in his movies like Some Like It Hot. But what made Billy Wilder such an unstoppable talent, and he's one of those rare directors where he wrote and or directed great movies across many decades from like basically the 1930s through the 1970s, but he was a writer-director. He wasn't waiting around for great material. He was creating that great material, and long before he was directing some of his early classics, he was writing classics for other directors. He was working with writer Charles Brackett, who was his writing partner from 1936 through 1950. Famously, their partnership ended on Sunset Boulevard, but we'll get to that in a second. But with Charles Brackett, I mean, he wrote Ninotchka for Ernst Lubitsch, one of the funniest movies of the 1930s. And he also wrote Ball of Fire with Charles Brackett for director Howard Hawks, one of the best directors of that era. But when he transitioned to directing, he ultimately became, I think, one of the most successful writer-directors ever, up there with Preston Sturges or any other writer-director that you care to mention. And he's one of the only directors where I have copies of his screenplay in book form. And when you read Sunset Boulevard, what's great is that it's reprinted in the same style in which it was written back in the late 40s, where the camera movements are on one side and the dialogue's on the other. And I've never seen another writer do it that way, where you have like, you basically like screenwriting, because he knew he was going to direct it. He was already designing and building the look of the movie in the screenplay, whereas usually a screenwriter is like, in a coffee shop scribbling away, hoping that somebody will buy it. And then the director, like, maybe they'll keep the dialogue, but they throw out everything else. But if you want to study what is a great shooting script that was actually used for the movie, you really can't do better than Sunset Boulevard. It's just an absolute masterpiece on the page and obviously a masterpiece on the screen. And what's fascinating about the year 1950 is how it presents us with this great unholy trinity of movies about the dark side of show business. And the first of which is In a Lonely Place, which I reviewed earlier this year, which is a great film noir about screenwriting. And then we get Sunset Boulevard in the summer, and then we get All About Eve in the fall. And obviously, All About Eve is only tangentially about movies. It's mostly about the world of theater. But all three of these movies have a really dark, cynical, biting, oftentimes sardonic view of what it means to make a living when you're trying to tell stories either on the stage or on the screen. And if you look for signs of optimism or hope, you can find them. Like the character of Betty in Sunset Boulevard is one of the few bright spots where this is what it's all about. Ambition and creativity and talent and drive.
I just think that picture should say a little something.
Oh, one of the message kids. Just a story won't do. You'd have turned down Gone with the Wind.
No, that was me. I said, who wants to see a Civil War picture?
And you can see the world of Sunset Boulevard is not completely bleak and cynical. Otherwise, it'd be unendurable because it's filled with tons of humor. You have fucking William Holden in here, who's one of the most charming, charismatic, humorous actors who ever walked or crawled. So I don't want to overstate the case that Sunset Boulevard is just like some grim, depressing journey through the dark side of Hollywood, because a lot of this movie is both celebrating and condemning everything that's wonderful and ridiculous and like just truly disgusting about the wonderful world of Hollywood. And if you like Hollywood history, at a certain point you have to just embrace the fact that the dark side and the light side are equally fascinating. Like a book like Hollywood Babylon. I don't believe a word in this book, but I think I've read it 3 times, and it basically covers Hollywood from like the teens through the early 60s, all the murder and the drug abuse and all the mayhem and a lot of the chaos on the sets of the films of Erich von Stroheim, who is featured very prominently in this movie. More on Erich von Stroheim in a bit, but I've always found like the myths and the legends about Hollywood to be irresistible, as well as the history. And that brings us back to Sunset Boulevard, where I feel like all the myths and all the legends and I guess the stories that Hollywood would like to believe and the stories that they would like to have buried, for all time.
Because this is a Hollywood story about the people who make the movies. The little ones that you never hear of, like Betty and me. The great ones, like Cecil B. DeMille. All those who knew Norma Desmond, a strange woman who left her mark on all of us who crossed her path.
They're all here in this movie, and it's kind of like the perfect summation of everything that Hollywood stands for, both good and bad, leading up to 1950, where it's like everything's on prominent display in terms of the art and the talent, but also where all the bodies are buried, and that's why the movie is just endlessly rewatchable. But I should say, while I love watching movies with stories set in Hollywood or watching documentaries about Hollywood history, I don't like propaganda. I don't like puff pieces. I don't like it when you basically get the sense that like these Hollywood figures have like a tube running right from their asshole to their nose and they're getting high on the smell of their own farts. Like shows like The Studio with Seth Rogen, I want nothing to do with it. I like the movies with a little bit of edge to them, like Robert Altman's The Player, or a better example would be Mulholland Drive by David Lynch, a movie about the dark side of what happens to actresses when they come to Hollywood. And quick side note, David Lynch is obsessed with Sunset Boulevard. If you love the movies of David Lynch and you want to understand what are some of the movies that kind of informed his aesthetic or informed his approach to movies like Mulholland Drive, Sunset Boulevard and Mulholland Drive would make a damn good double feature. But I mentioned that new show, The Studio, earlier and how I wasn't into it, and I'll tell you why. Of the episodes that I saw, there was not a single scene or a single moment that might upset or annoy or criticize any prominent members of the Hollywood community. Seth Rogen is a Hollywood player, and he's not trying to ruffle any feathers. Sunset Boulevard was the opposite. Sunset Boulevard was divisive. I mean, famously, Louis B. Mayer, one of the most powerful people ever to work in showbiz, he stormed out of a screening and had some very harsh words for Billy Wilder for his depiction of the Hollywood community. And Billy Wilder, who was not afraid to talk a little shit and was at the peak of his powers, he was more than happy to talk a little shit right back at Louis B. Mayer. And there were plenty of actors and actresses who were approached to work on this movie, and they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't even want their names mentioned in the context of the movie. But I think a lot of people failed to understand about this movie is that it wasn't trying to be propaganda. It wasn't trying to celebrate Hollywood. It is possible to love the movie business and hate the movie business in equal measure, and the two emotions don't cancel each other out because there is plenty to despise. There's so much ridiculous behavior.
Greatest thing that could happen to you. Now you'll have to sit behind the typewriter. Now you'll have to write.
What do you think I've been doing? I need $300.
Sweetheart, maybe what you'll need is another agent.
And the fact that there were so many people in Hollywood who had a giant stick up their ass that were getting upset by this movie at that time shows how the more things change, the more things stay the same. Because at any point in Hollywood history, you can always find people who have a far too elevated opinion of their own industry and of their own contributions.
And teach your friends some manners. Tell him without me, you wouldn't have any job, because without me, there wouldn't be any Paramount studio.
You're right, Miss Desmond.
And while I'm on the subject of the topic of the more things change, the more they stay the same, famously, Billy Wilder went into production on this movie with only 61 pages of the script finished. It's a masterpiece, but a lot of it was written very quickly, and the movie consequently was shot sequentially. But these days, a lot of people make fun of these big Hollywood productions for going into production without a finished screenplay and giving them some harsh words. But I'm like, well, Billy Wilder did it 75 years ago. Obviously, it helps if you have Charles Brackett in his office scribbling while you're shooting, so you can multitask. In any case, I just find it hilarious how sometimes, while the technology might change and the faces might change and the degree of talent might change, there are certain trends and certain approaches to making movies in Hollywood that'll never really change. But I realize I've been going quite a bit at this point without talking about the story or the actors involved, so maybe it's time to start unpacking the story of Sunset Boulevard. And if I were to summarize the story, I would do so by saying this is a story about what happens to writers when they go to Hollywood. The same way Mulholland Drive is a movie about what happens to actresses when they go to Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard is a movie about what happens to writers. And this is my last spoiler warning. If you've not seen the movie, bail out now. Go watch the movie and you can thank me later. The fact that this movie opens with a dead writer face down in a pool, in a shot that was really hard to achieve, but they finally figured it out with the clever use of some mirrors. But the fact that this movie starts with a dead screenwriter face down in a pool talking to the audience in the afterlife about how this is going to be the story about how he ended up in that pool that he always wanted to have.
The poor dope. He always wanted a pool.
You already know that this is going to be kind of a bleak, biting, sardonic, cynical journey through the creative process in Hollywood. And in that, Billy Wilder got started in Hollywood as a writer before he was a director. Nobody knows more about the dark side of being a writer in Hollywood than Billy Wilder himself. And what's incredible about the high wire act of the screenplay constructed by Wilder and Brackett is how we're getting two different points of view from the same character. One is like the omniscient narrator who knows about his death and who knows about everything that's happened. And the other is the point of view of the character when he's blissfully naive and has no idea what's in store for him, where he's still hoping that somehow he can write this terrible screenplay, Salome, with Norma Desmond, but also write his other screenplay on the side with Betty, and that maybe he can emerge from this with a few dollars in his pocket.
Just a minute, you. You're a writer, you said.
Why?
Are you or aren't you?
That's what it says on my guild card.
But it's hard enough to write one good simple story where you're just following a character from his point of view. The fact that they're telling like two stories at once from the same character, just a marvel of good old-fashioned classic story construction. And for people who are interested in the art of screenwriting or the art of collaboration, I like how we see two different depictions of the collaborative process in this movie, because we get some scenes where Norma and Joe are writing side by side, where she's like kind of like her fingers all gnarled up and she's just willing him to like this her first draft, and anytime he makes a suggestion she'll say like, "What? Cut away from me?"
Just a scene I threw out.
Which scene?
The one where you go to the slave market. It's better to cut directly to John the Baptist.
Cut away from me?
Put that scene back in. I mean, anyway, a total nightmare to work with. But we also get to see him working with Betty, where it's like they're up late at night and they're smoking and drinking coffee and having a blast, and you really get a sense of what it was like to be a screenwriter at that time, whether you're working for a tyrannical overlord like Norma Desmond or working with a bright up-and-coming writer. And probably the most famous bit of trivia surrounding this movie was the original scene for this movie that had to be completely reshot and reworked because the movie originally opened up in a morgue, the Los Angeles County morgue, with Joe Gillis' character being wheeled in. And there was a conversation between the dead bodies in there, and some of the dialogue, there's a fat man who says, "Where did you drown? The ocean?" And Gillis says, "No, swimming pool." And the fat man says, "A husky fellow like you?" And Gillis says, "Well, I had a few extra holes in me, 2 in the chest and 1 in the stomach." And the fat man says, "You were murdered?" And Gillis says, "Yes, I was murdered." But when the movie was previewed to some audiences before the premiere, audience members started cracking up at the scene. They didn't quite know that it was meant to be a little humorous, but not like an outright comedy. But they couldn't like recover from it. They couldn't get on the movie's wavelength because of that unusual scene. I wish I could see that scene intact as originally filmed and written, but yeah, even Billy Wilder, who was firing on all cylinders at the peak of his powers, coming off an incredible string of success at Paramount, even he had to pause and revisit his original conception for the opening of the movie. But the new opening for the movie with the writer face down in the pool, it is just complete and total perfection. But what gives the movie this epic sense of Shakespearean tragedy and grandeur is that we also have Gloria Swanson and Erich von Stroheim in here as Norma Desmond and Max von Mayerling, who in the context of the movie and in real life were titans of the silent era who now are just a shadow of their former selves, kind of forgotten by the outside world. And while people think silent movies are forgotten today in 2025, the same absolutely held true in 1950.
You're Norma Desmond. Used to be in silent pictures. Used to be big.
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
And it was fairly recent history. I mean, the silent era pretty much started wrapping up in the late 20s, apart from a few exceptions, like when Charlie Chaplin made City Lights in the early 30s. But like the great heyday of the silent era at that time was only 20 years old. It'd be like talking about movies from 2005 today as if 2005 was like, in a completely different millennium. Like all those movies are just gone, forgotten. Nobody remembers the actors, the filmmakers, blah, blah, blah. It just shows how quickly Hollywood likes to forget their own history, neglect their own talent, neglect their own stars and filmmakers, and move on. It's always about moving forward. What's happening now? What's in the present?
They're dead. They're finished. There was a time in this business when they had the eyes of the whole wide world.
Once again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But what gives this movie this kind of eerie, uncanny quality where you can't even quite tell, was it by accident or by design or by luck? But William Holden, Gloria Swanson, and Erich von Stroheim, all the characters they're playing in the movie are reflecting who they were at that time in real life. While William Holden was an actor, not a screenwriter, he was already considered kind of over the hill and down on his luck. He had made a big splash with Golden Boy in 1939, never lived up to that initial promise, and was already considered a fading star. Montgomery Clift was supposed to play the role, but he backed out at the last second. So William Holden got lucky and just got this role at the last second. So he's got a lot in common with this character that he's playing, Joe Gillis, where like he's just on the verge of buying that bus ticket back home.
Call Regis Department, find out what they have on bases loaded.
They're pretty hot about it over at 20th. Except I think Zanuck's all wet. Can you see Ty Power as the shortstop?
But Gloria Swanson and Erich von Stroheim, in the 1920s, they were absolute legends. I mean, Erich von Stroheim, I've got a book here on his career, the Life and Films of Erich von Stroheim, and he's featured prominently in Hollywood Babylon. And if you want to know more about him, you have to watch the movie The Man You Loved to Hate from 1979. Of all the crazy, temperamental, tyrannical directors of the 1920s, the kind of people that would walk around with like a riding crop and like wear a monocle and work people for days without sleep and giving them Benzedrine and cocaine and it was just, people would emerge from his film sets dazed and confused, like covered in bite marks, like what the fuck did we just do? He was insane, and his movies would go horribly over schedule, horribly over budget. He would deliver 12-hour cuts. The movies would be cut to pieces, and it didn't take him long to wear out his welcome. But Foolish Wives is worth seeing. Greed, there's only like 20% of it that remains, but what remains is absolutely stunning. The Wedding March might be his most complete movie, but once again, he went horribly over budget, horribly over schedule, and basically had to be shut down. And then Queen Kelly, which he made with Gloria Swanson. And Gloria Swanson was one of the biggest stars of the 1920s. But Erich von Stroheim was so out of control in Queen Kelly, apparently Gloria Swanson reached out to Joseph Kennedy, JFK and RFK's father, who was producing Queen Kelly, who she was screwing at the time, and said, like, I'm being directed by a madman, he's a crazy person, like, what am I going to do? In any case, shortly thereafter, both her career as well as Erich von Stroheim's career, they would not survive the transition to sound.
I guess I don't have to tell you who the star was. They were always her pictures. That's all she wanted to see.
A lot of actors and a lot of directors who thrived in the 1920s crashed and burned in the early 30s. The combination of switching to sound and talking movies, as well as the Great Depression, just a lot of careers just were dashed upon the rocks, including Erich von Stroheim and Gloria Swanson. But all was forgiven by the time it came to work together again on Sunset Boulevard. But like the characters they're playing are who they are in real life. That's what gives this movie this like haunted house quality where you can feel the echoes of the past. Those ghosts of the past are constantly rearing their ugly head. Perfect example would be that scene where Max is explaining to Joe how back in the silent era there were 3 directors who showed promise.
There were 3 young directors who showed promise in those days. D.W. Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille, and Max von Mayerling.
And obviously he is talking about himself. I would include a lot of other directors like, Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau and Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. There are a lot or even Joseph von Sternberg. There are a lot of great directors in the 1920s doing some of the making some of the best movies that people would ever see. And that reminds me, there's a great interview with Billy Wilder when he's talking about working with Erich von Stroheim. And this is decades later when he's looking back, but he said to Erich von Stroheim, your problem is that you were always 10 years ahead of the industry.
Then I said, your problem always was, Erich, was you were always 10 years ahead of your time. And he looks at me and he says, 20.
His pride and his ambition remained undiminished all those years later, even though he was not directing anymore. And apparently on the set of Sunset Boulevard, Erich von Stroheim was always inching his chair closer and closer to the camera. He was still absolutely fascinated by the process and was really interested by Billy Wilder's approach to telling the story. But when it comes to the character of Norma Desmond as portrayed by Gloria Swanson, she's a strong contender for the most interesting character ever put on the screen in any era. When it comes to the way the part was written and the way the part was performed and dressed and the entire world that they constructed around her. And she was heavily invested in the creative process, working alongside costume designer Edith Head. And Edith Head probably won more Oscars as a costume designer than anyone else in history. But Gloria Swanson was like, no, this is the fashion, these are the styles, this is the decor, and that set they constructed, her world, it's nothing but pictures and glamour shots of her and a movie screen that's up on the wall that, of course, only plays movies that she starred in. But she's living in this perpetual dreamland. And there's this eerie line at one point where Joe Gillis says,
I didn't argue with her. You don't yell at a sleepwalker. He may fall and break his neck.
And she's living in this absolute fantasy that Max von Mayerling is kind of maintaining around her, writing her fake fan letters and letting her believe that the entire world is always screaming for her return, not her comeback. She hates that word, her return.
Only asking. I didn't know you were planning a comeback.
I hate that word. It's return.
You could write an entire book about all the subtle nuances and contradictions of her character because on one hand, she won it all. She won the lottery of life. She became an insanely successful movie star and then invested wisely, and now she's worth millions, and she can basically live in the lap of luxury for the rest of her life. But she's also like a body without skin and terrified of the outside world. I mean, she'll throw parties just for her and Joe.
There are no other guests. We don't want to share this night with other people. This is for you and me.
Oh?
Hold me tighter.
Or she'll have screenings for just her and Joe because she's so much nicer than going out. She doesn't want to have to confront the outside world where people might not remember her. And this is a world where one time she was so famous, as Max said at one point in the story, one of her admirers, a Maharaja from India, he asked her for one of her stockings and then later strangled himself with it. I mean, these kinds of just perverse details. Only Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett can think up this crazy fucking shit. And I'm sure Erich von Stroheim was definitely a bad influence as far as those perverse details are concerned.
There was a Maharaja who came all the way from India to beg one of her silk stockings. Later, he strangled himself with it.
But when we're first introduced to the characters, this is just some absolutely masterful storytelling because Joe Gillis is basically hiding in her garage. He thinks it's an abandoned house, and he's trying to escape the people. They're trying to reclaim his car due to missing payments. And as he starts approaching this old, decaying mansion...
It was a great big white elephant of a place. The kind crazy movie people built in the crazy 20s.
In the 1920s were crazy, where both the art and the money were never higher as far as Hollywood was concerned because it was pure visual storytelling, and so it was all pantomime and these crazy sets and really exotic photographic styles. It was just completely, totally insane. And at that time, if you were successful in Hollywood, it would rank you as one of the most highly paid people in the world. Charlie Chaplin, when he was in his prime, he was not only one of the highest paid people in Hollywood. If you were to combine every industry on the planet, Charlie Chaplin, I think, was in the top 10 income earners in the 1920s. It was just absolutely insane just how much money and drugs and sex and booze were flowing at that time. And the character of Norma Desmond, her mansion is basically like not a time capsule because it's all decaying, but it's like a relic from the past where the pool is empty and the tennis court, like the net is sagging and it's overgrown. Everything is kind of rotting and weeds are growing over.
And of course she had a pool. Who didn't then? Mabel Norman and John Gilbert must have swum in it 10,000 midnights ago.
And of course she's inside having a funeral for her monkey. It's like, if you want to, what is a snapshot of Hollywood lunacy? It's a crazy actress who's not left her house in years, who has more money than God, who is having her own private funeral for her monkey. And there's actually a really funny story about that monkey. Decades later, there was a situation where this is the mid-90s, Billy Wilder and Nancy Reagan were at some party for the opening of the production of Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical adaptation of Sunset Boulevard. And somebody was asking Billy Wilder, well, what does the monkey mean? Like, what is like the hidden meaning of the scene with the chimp? And apparently Billy Wilder, just to shock Nancy Reagan, said, "Don't you understand? Norma Desmond was fucking the monkey before Joe Gillis came along." And according to the legend or the story, Nancy Reagan about passed out when she overheard Billy Wilder say that.
It was all very queer. But queerer things were yet to come.
But the reality is that both Norma Desmond as well as Gloria Swanson had multiple husbands. Apparently, Gloria Swanson divorced her most recent husband to move back to L.A. to make this movie. And in the context of the film, Norma Desmond, her first husband, Max von Mayerling, was the director who discovered her.
I discovered her when she was 16. I made her a star, and I cannot let her be destroyed.
And now he has just been completely, totally emasculated. Emasculated to a degree. He's working as her butler. He's no longer even allowed to sleep in his old bedroom because Joe Gillis, basically whoever's her current boyfriend or husband, gets to have that bedroom. But he's basically forced to watch and observe as she humiliates herself, seducing all these younger lovers or the monkey, whatever you choose to believe. But at the same time, he still has total control because this fantasy in which she lives, the only way it can be maintained is by the diligence of Max von Mayerling.
There aren't any fan letters except the ones you write.
That isn't true! Max!
Madame is the greatest star of them all.
He's emasculated to a degree, but at the same time, he gets the ultimate revenge because he gets to basically be the person that preserves what remains of her sanity. But as we see in this house, it's haunted without being supernatural. The DP, let me look up his name real quick, did a very clever thing. His name is John F. Seitz. He learned this trick while working on Double Indemnity, but he would take this very fine dust and he would kind of fling it into the air in front of the camera so that a little bit of the dust would kind of gather around the lens, and it just gave this like eerie kind of like ancient quality to the scenes inside the house. But just sometimes like the most beautiful techniques are the simplest. And I think John F. Seitz, as great as the screenplay is and as great as the performances are, the photography for this movie is just second to none. But getting back to these fascinating contradictions with Norma Desmond, she both loves the movie business and hates the movie business all at once. And what's hilarious is how even in 1950, there were people already proclaiming that Hollywood was dead. She's like, no, they're dead, they're finished, blah, blah, blah. Like, the idea of introducing dialogue and talking into movies for her was just the absolute death of the art form.
We didn't need dialogue. We had faces. There just aren't any faces like that anymore.
And in any era of the movies, from the late 1800s up to the present day, there will always be aging actors and aging directors who, rightly or wrongly, will be talking about how once upon a time, movies were better. And depending upon which era you're talking about, you're probably right. Like for me, the late 20s to the early 30s and the early to mid 70s, those are my two favorite periods. And any period that's not either of those periods, I'll say, oh, they're dead, they're finished.
They're dead, they're finished.
I totally get that point of view. There are certain periods where the creativity of Hollywood and the business are perfectly in lockstep and the absolute magic can happen. But it's like she craves the idea of making a return to Hollywood, but at the same time has to condemn it because she's no longer a part of it. And she knows that the world has moved on. But another fascinating contradiction is how she can be both completely fragile but also domineering and tyrannical all at once. Like she's terrified of the outside world and learning that everybody's forgotten about her. However, with the people who remember her know who she is, I mean, she throws her weight around. Like, perfect example would be the fact that she is screwing her employee that she has hired to write her new screenplay for Salome, with enough material there for 6 movies, as Joe Gillis points out at one point in the movie.
This is to be a very important picture. I've written it myself. Took me years.
Looks like enough for 6 important pictures.
It's a story of Salome. I think I'll have DeMille direct it.
DeMille?
And he's basically an indentured servant where he doesn't get a salary. She doesn't want to be small and actually pay him. She just likes giving him, really, really nice cigarette cases or nice suits or nice evening attire so that he can look pretty when they go out and that sort of thing.
The camel's hair will do.
Well, as long as the lady's paying for it, why not take the vicuna?
Or when they're having their private parties. But he never actually sees any real money. Or when she's throwing her parties for the Waxworks, where you have all these relics from a bygone era who are not as well off as she is, and you can tell she's totally confident in her element, loving her game of bridge. I think they're playing bridge. But we have to pause for a moment and talk about the Waxworks. Because while Cecil B. DeMille is still a very famous and very successful director at this point, some of their peers from that period have fallen on harder times, like Anna Q. Nielsen, H.B. Warner, who once played Jesus, as well as one of my all-time favorites, Buster Keaton. And when I first saw this movie, I'd seen a few Buster Keaton movies. I think at this point, I'd seen The General for a silent film class, and I love The General. It's one of my all-time favorite silent movies. It's just a staggering movie, and it's 100 years old at this point. And I think I'd seen the short Convict 13 at the Virginia Film Festival. My college, UVA, they would have a Virginia Film Festival every fall, and there was like a silent short program they put together where they had a couple different shorts from a couple different silent film pioneers like Harry Langdon and Harry Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. So I'd seen Convict 13, but when I was watching Sunset Boulevard for the first time, and I saw Buster Keaton, then he started to speak, it almost made like my soul like recoil in horror seeing this silent film icon who I'd never even like associated with him with having a voice or an accent.
Spade?
Pass.
3 no trump.
Pass.
Pass.
But you can see how in the quiet of her own home, Norma Desmond is still absolutely in charge and in her element. But what's interesting is when she goes to the Paramount lot, you start to see some of her fantasies being challenged and confronted because she has submitted a screenplay to Cecil B. DeMille. She's convinced he's going to direct it. And there have been a lot of calls coming from Paramount. And she doesn't know, and we don't know yet, but we learn before she does, that the reason they keep calling is because they want her car for a movie. So she storms onto the set of Samson and Delilah, where Cecil B. DeMille was actually shooting the movie for Paramount. And apparently Cecil B. DeMille was happy to be in the movie, but he had to be paid a grotesque sum of money to be in the movie. But it's uncanny having him there, calling her young fella and then reminiscing about the old days when they were like dancing on tables and that sort of thing, when they actually did used to work together in the 1920s. So it's pitch perfect casting. But when they're on the set, she thinks that he's playing hard to get and being coy, and that he actually wants her screenplay, and that he wants to work with her.
Very sorry, Mr. DeMille.
It must be about that awful script of hers. What can I tell her?
And he's trying desperately to avoid confronting her over the fact that her screenplay is dreadful, because we've seen him on the set already saying, like, oh my God, this must be about that terrible screenplay. What do I say? But in a brief moment of kindness, this movie does acknowledge, where he says, basically, she was a tyrant toward the end. She was a terror to work with, but not always. Like in the early days, she had a lot of spirit and was incredible to work with.
With more courage and wit and heart, they never came together in one youngster.
I understand she was a terror to work with.
Only toward the end.
But we see her on the set, and this is when like her total mental derangement really starts to take shape, which will truly bloom and bear fruit by the end of the movie. But she's on the set and like swatting microphones away, which is a great little scene where she's like, ugh, like what is this? Like she's swatting it away like it's a bug. But when one of the technicians recognizes her and shines a light on her, she starts like surrendering over to this dream, the spell that she will completely surrender to by the end of the movie, as people start swarming her saying, oh my God, that's Norma Desmond. But outside, we get a dose of reality. Max von Merling has learned that Paramount is only interested in her car, not in her script, not in her. And meanwhile, Joe Gillis has bumped into Betty Schaefer, played by Nancy Olson, who is incredible in this movie, who's probably the most wholesome, idealistic component of this movie. But what she's been trying to find him, and she's been trying to reach out to him, because she wants to take one character or one idea from one of his screenplays that she admittedly did not like, but she wants to turn that into a full-blown screenplay, and she wants to co-write it with him because she doesn't want to be a reader her entire life. She's got aspirations, she's got dreams. But if you're looking for a glimmer of hope and love and happiness in this very depressing movie, it's within the relationship between Betty and Joe, because throughout the entire movie we get this really interesting kind of ebb and flow, where initially she's talking trash about one of his screenplays when Joe Gillis is looking for work with this producer who's got ulcers and all sorts of problems, and he's bemoaning the fact that he turned down Gone with the Wind and things like that. But then later on, Betty and Joe are working together. They're doing so in secret behind Norma's back, because Joe's having to sneak out at night, but she knows she'll completely freak out if she knows that he's writing a screenplay with a pretty young girl on the side. And then toward the end of the movie, when Betty and Joe finally fall in love, she's engaged to one of his best friends, and they have a great rapport between the three of them. But of course, William Holden is ultimately going. There's no way you can remain in love with a lowly assistant director when William Holden is around. And on the set, when they were kissing, having this long kiss, it was apparently William Holden's wife who started shouting out, "Cut, cut," because she totally objected to the intensity of the kiss that they were putting on the screen. But goddamn, when you're talking about Norma Desmond, there's so many great scenes, it's almost hard to do justice to all of them. And once again, it's always this contrast between the fragile, insecure little girl with the tyrannical overlord. Like when they're watching her movie, Queen Kelly, in the context of Sunset Boulevard, where it's like, if you're into film history and great storytelling, like your brain just starts to kind of come unglued. But she'll be sitting on the couch with her arm wrapped around Joe, falling in love and just, really totally immersed in the moment. And then stand up and almost like some sort of like totalitarian dictator start issuing proclamations about the movie business and that sort of thing. Just those mood swings are just so fascinating. Or how she can go from being like so needy and so vulnerable and talking about how like Joe needs to have patience with her, and how like at a time when she's so vulnerable and so desperate to make her return that he has to be incredibly patient. But then we'll see her making these phone calls to Betty late at night, like Gollum in Lord of the Rings, just scowling and whispering all these horrible things into the phone. It's evil and pitiful and awe-inspiring all at once. It's really challenging to create a character where you feel deep swells of pity for, also complete contempt for, but at the same time, awe and admiration for their past accomplishments, all at the same time. Which leads me to one of the best scenes of the movie, the scene that ultimately led to the breakup of Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett, where apparently they almost came to blows over how the scene was being written. And these are guys who had enjoyed incredible success together, won Oscars together. It blows my mind that they could have such a severe disagreement over one scene. Or who knows, maybe there had been private resentments that have been building for years, and it was just this scene that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But the scene where we see a montage, a highlight reel, where Norma Desmond basically goes into training like a prize fighter to get prepared for the comeback she believes Cecil B. DeMille is going to direct. But we see her doing skin treatments and physical training and doing all these things, trying to kind of resurrect and preserve her physical beauty. And apparently Charles Brackett felt that the scene was too cruel and that it placed too much of an emphasis on what age had done to her beauty since the 1920s. Whereas Wilder insisted that this was absolutely like an essential component to how she was trying to reclaim the glories of the past, reclaim her youth from the past. And Wilder obviously got his way, and he told his friends at the time he would not be making any more movies with Charles Brackett. Billy Wilder was not a fan of people changing or pushing back on what he wanted to do when it came to writing. If you were an actor in his movies and you tried to change a line of dialogue, you weren't going to last long on a Billy Wilder production. He wrote his screenplays precisely the way he wanted them to be performed on the screen. And whether you were a writing partner or an acting partner or whatever, it was the movies were going to be made the way Billy Wilder wanted them to. But I find it ironic that it would be a scene without dialogue that would lead to this famous writing duo splitting up, because Billy Wilder was not famous for his incredible visual style. He was much more famous for writing great screenplays and having great performances. But I think it's a little unfair when people criticize him for not having an interesting visual style or aesthetic to his movies. You watch a movie like Double Indemnity, it's a quintessential film noir. Or you watch Some Like It Hot or The Apartment. Those movies look great. But if you were to argue what is stronger in his movies, the dialogue or the visuals, then of course the dialogue. And luckily Billy Wilder would find a new writing partner years later with I.A.L. Diamond, with whom he worked from 1957 to 1981, and he had a second golden age all over again, writing all sorts of great movies with I.A.L. Diamond. But getting back to Wilder and Brackett, at least their legendary collaboration drew to a close with a screenplay that is arguably the best screenplay they ever wrote together, because every single scene is solid gold. And the stuff that I find interesting now, knocking at the door of 50 versus a starry-eyed movie freak back in when I was 20 or 21 when I first saw it, seeing the way that Norma Desmond tries to manipulate Joe Gillis by kind of dangling the prospect of money but only giving him treats and kind of dressing him up almost like he's a doll or a toy. She'll be withering in her condescension and scorn, must you chew gum? And
Why begrudge me a little fun? I just want you to look nice. And must you chew gum?
I'm getting very bored by that shirt of yours and that jacket. I mean, she's so critical. But at the same time, the moment he provides even a whiff of a rumor that he might have a life outside this house or a girl that he's interested in or other aspirations, she'll completely crumble and fall to pieces.
There may be some girl that I'm crazy about.
Who? Some car hop or dress extra?
She's such a bitch and also so pitiful all at once. That is really tough to pull off. And Gloria Swanson, what's incredible is how her great heyday as an actress was in the silent era, pure pantomime, as she says in the movie frequently.
We didn't need dialogue. We had faces.
But back then, the acting style was much more physical. And if you want to communicate something, you had to do it all with your body language because you had no dialogue apart from a few title cards. But the fact that she could transition from that style of acting to putting on such an incredible performance here, it's just staggering what she was able to accomplish. And I like how as the movie it continues to evolve, she gets to lean into more and more of the pantomime that she was so successful with back in the 1920s. So we got to talk about the ending, which is one of the best endings that has ever been cooked up for any movie. So we get to the end of the movie and we've come full circle. We're back to Joe Gillis floating face down in the pool. He's been shot in the back, shot in the gut. This is what Hollywood does to aspiring screenwriters. But then we get a little bit more of the movie as we see Norma Desmond completely lost in this fantasy that she's constructed. She believes she's about to make a movie with Cecil B. DeMille. She's in total denial of what she just did. She's just combing her hair and getting prepared and just in a total dreamland, surrounded by cops and reporters, a total media circus. And she's just, she's completely retreated inward. And then we get to see Erich von Stroheim have one final great moment as a director playing Max von Mayerling, but we get to see a little taste of what he must have been like as a director. But he tells Norma Desmond,
"The cameras have arrived."
They have. Tell Mr. DeMille I'll be on the set at once.
The cameras have arrived. And she's like, what? The cameras have arrived? I mean, she's completely, lost inside of her madness. And the cops are like, wait a second, what's going on here? And they realize, wait a second, this might actually be the easiest way to get her downstairs. And so then we get to see her in character in this movie she's constructed in her mind. And once again, this is Gloria Swanson, just holding nothing back, just resurrecting the 1920s right before her eyes. She comes down the stairs and she announces that she's ready for her close-up.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
And then starts moving towards the camera. like almost, I mean, she's as terrifying as like any monster from like the great heyday of like Universal monsters. But what's great is how we, for a brief shining moment, we do get to see Erich von Stroheim with the news crew directing the scene. And he's like, roll camera, and, action. And the way he does it, it's like, God damn, like Erich von Stroheim, he still had it. And he was still doing acting work and famously worked with Jean Renoir, like on The Grand Illusion. His career after the 1920s wasn't a total tragedy, but what's great is how Billy Wilder just gave him for a few seconds a chance to really show the world what he had and what qualities he was able to bring to the table. So if you are interested in kind of the crazy, like destructive, like psychotic side of movie history, where the artistic results were as fantastic as the business results were catastrophic, Erich von Stroheim is one of those great tragic figures. Like, he represents to the 1920s what Orson Welles represents to the talkie area, where you almost have like too much talent for one person, and ultimately just it all just comes unspooled. But as I mentioned earlier in this video, one of the key distinctions that kind of separates the men from the boys in my eyes when it comes to the all-time great directors, can you sustain greatness over several decades? Because obviously your talent might ebb and flow, the industry might change, but how well can you adapt and still do some of the best work of your career? Like Akira Kurosawa was making great stuff in the late 40s, and he was still making great stuff in the early 80s. Or Ingmar Bergman, he was making great stuff in the early 50s and still making great stuff in the early 80s. Or Luis Buñuel, great stuff in the late 20s up through the late 70s. It's just like, there's like the Hall of Fame directors, and then the other great directors who I still love. They have like that great 10-year period where maybe they do their best work all in that one tight little chunk. But Billy Wilder's in the mix as one of those guys who was able to make great work across several decades. And it was just an honor and a privilege singing the praises of one of his best movies here today on this channel. In any case, these are my favorite kinds of videos to make, whether I'm doing 50th anniversary videos, 75th anniversary videos, and I'm still itching to do a 100th anniversary video. I got to do it between now and the end of the year, a top 10 movies of 1925 video, because I've seen a lot of movies from 1925. I've seen enough where I can already make a list and have to leave a few movies on the side, but there's still a few left that I want to see. But I love making these anniversary videos. I know they're never going to be the main drivers in terms of traffic, but when it comes to sustaining my interest in film history and my love and passion for great old movies, these are by far my favorite kinds of videos to make. So I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I did making it. But please remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell if you want to see more videos like this in the future. And there are a few more movies throughout the rest of the year that are begging for my attention when it comes to 75th and or 50th anniversary videos, so stay tuned for more videos like this in the future. But thanks again for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.